Hey guys, Canon R5 is finally here, and you've probably seen a lot of videos talking about the video specs and the overheating, but today I'm going to just concentrate on photography and give you my initial thoughts after 5 full days of solid use of this camera just for photography. Hi guys, Andy here with Camera Cravings. If you're new here, consider subscribing, click the bell for notifications of new videos, and if you've been waiting for photography reviews on this camera, there haven't been that many around. I'm not going to do a full review today because I haven't had enough time with the camera, but I am going to do my initial first thoughts and walk you through all the things about this camera that I wanted to know as someone buying it and potentially moving from the Sony system to this camera and the RF mount, and also just give you an idea of what it is like compared to other Canon cameras like the EOS R, the 5D Mark III and IV, and the 1DX, so that you can make better decisions on whether to buy this camera or not. I'm a photographer primarily. I do some video work, but mainly my business is photography, so I was really keen to get this in my hands as quickly as I could. I shoot Sony, but I wanted to see whether this camera could replace my current Sony system. And so, full disclosure, I've bought this camera with my own money. The glass that you see on it, the 15-35 RF, this is a rented lens. And then I've also got the 24-70 L lens, which is the EF mount with a mount adapter RF to EF, which I've also rented. The lens is one that I've owned for some time. So all of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on using these two lenses with the camera. Unfortunately, I don't have access to 24-70 or the 70-200 or any of those other lenses that they do for the RF mount. I am going to try and get hold of them in the future, but I wanted to get this video out to talk about the key features of the camera, what it's like to actually use and shoot with. And I've managed to shoot over the last few days a combination of a bit of portrait stuff, a little bit of landscape photography. I've also managed to do a full 3-hour shoot with mountain biking, so fast-paced action, sports, and I feel like I can now give you a good feel for what this camera can do, what it can't do, and where its strengths lie. And right off the bat, I'll tell you now, this is one of the best cameras I've ever used. I'll put a list up on screen somewhere here of all of the Sony cameras I've used in the past 5 or so years, and all of the Canon cameras I used before that when I used to shoot Canon. Everything up to the 5D Mark III I've shot with Canon. So I've not shot on the 5D Mark IV, and I've not shot on like the 1DX Mark III, but all of the previous cameras I've used and all of the Sony cameras I've used, this is definitely an absolute powerhouse. It's 45 megapixels and it can shoot 12 frames a second mechanical and up to 20 frames a second electronic. We'll get into all of that stuff later, but yeah, straight off the bat, if you don't want to watch the rest of the video, I would highly recommend this. From my initial testing, it is a joy to use this camera, and yeah, I've really enjoyed using it over the last few days, so much so that I really don't want to go back to the camera that I'm filming this on, which is the Sony a7R II. And yeah, I'm kind of seriously considering actually swapping systems to Canon. I have pre-ordered the Sony a7S III for video work, and it's, yeah, I've got to decide what I'm going to do, but this is a real tempting proposition. If they can sort out some of the overheating stuff with video, I would seriously consider buying, well, keeping this and then buying some RF glass. With that said, let's talk about this camera itself. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the ergonomics and the handling and the user interface on this camera. Obviously you've got your flip screen, which can be handy for low and high angles when you're photographing certain subjects. In the hand, this feels excellent. The button layout, everything is just really nice. And actually, coming from Sony, it's quite different. The body is bigger than the Sonys, even the latest Sonys, the a7R III and IV. Everything is really well laid out. The only issue I found with it was I've got quite small hands, and because this has, I think, got a fatter grip than the EOS R, it is a little bit harder to hold for me, just because I've got not the biggest hands, but I think in terms of button placement, the shutter button, and I've actually customized the AF on button to be my kind of autofocus. So I've separated the shutter, so back button focusing, and that works an absolute dream. I really like the top screen that shows you kind of all your information, so all your settings that you're currently in. And this camera has dials exactly where you want them. The only thing that I don't like compared to the Sonys is the Sonys have a front dial here, whereas this has it on the top. I think that's something I could easily get used to. You've also got the mode dial, which you've got the mode button and then the dial here, and then you've got a scroll wheel here as well. And you can customize all of these buttons to do different things. I also really like the RF mount and the ring on the lenses that you can customize to do different things like ISO, aperture, all sorts of things. So overall, I've been mightily impressed with the handling of this. The only thing I would say is a downside compared to things like the Sony system, for example, and the Fujis and some of the other smaller mirrorless cameras, is the size and weight of these is more towards DSLR end of things. This is still smaller than a 5D4, but the glass, the RF glass, is heavy and pretty bulky generally. Certainly this lens, this 15-35, is pretty massive. And to give you a comparison, I don't know if you can see the width difference there. This is quite a heavy lens, but the width of this and the kind of bulk of it is pretty substantial. But yeah, overall, this camera is a joy to use in the hand. The EVF is fantastic. It's 5 million dot, so it's very high resolution. There's very little lag I've found in pretty much every mode. I have found it seems like there's a tiny bit of lag when you're shooting 20 frames a second in the full electronic mode, but I need to do some more testing on that. The LCD screen is lovely. The touch interface works a dream. It's really nice. I wish my Sony cameras had this. I know Sony are moving more towards that, but yeah, that has been fantastic. And yeah, overall, really like the ergonomics of this camera, really like the feel of it, and yeah, can't really praise it highly enough. I would also say that the menu, given I've not really shot on Canon cameras for a few years now, I've been able to pick up the menu system and all the settings really quickly. There is a lot in this camera, a lot of different settings to customize, and it's all been pretty intuitive. There's only been a couple of times that I've sort of struggled to find something, but usually that can be rectified by using the touchscreen easily. The only thing I didn't like was the joystick. When it arrived out of the box is set to nothing, so you actually have to go in and customize what that is set to, because it doesn't do anything straight out of the box, or it didn't when I got it. But yeah, everything else really good. It has 2 card slots, as you probably already know. So you've got CF Express and then a UHS 2 fast SD card slot. I haven't yet bought a CF Express card, mainly because I'm not sure if I'm going to keep this camera, and they cost £300 upwards to £1,000. So that's a big investment with this camera. I did buy a fast V90 SD card to put in here, and that was about £130. So I've been shooting on that, which, to be honest, for photos, it will keep up with the burst modes really well. The only modes that you can't do is a couple of the video modes, which I've not really been testing yet. So do consider that when you're thinking about buying this camera, that if you want redundancy, you will need a CF Express and an SD card in there to shoot photos to both, and they are very expensive. Hopefully the prices will come down in future. Talking about the battery life, this camera has the new Canon battery, and it's got that little gold thing on it. It's the LPE6NH, and it is pretty good for battery life. Actually, I've been quite impressed with this. I would say, I think Canon rates it about 300 shots, or maybe 380. In my testing, I've managed to get quite a lot more than that. On the day I shot a lot of mountain biking, so I was shooting a lot of bursts and yeah, a lot of high frame rate stuff, and AF tracking on, had the viewfinder set to the faster kind of smooth, I think it's 120 FPS. You can swap between 60 and 120. I had it set to the higher rate. So basically maxing out pretty much everything this camera can do. The IBIS was on, all of that. And it's actually gave me almost 700 shots on a single charge. Moving on, let's talk about the files actually coming off this camera. Because it's 45 megapixel, the file sizes are pretty large. On average, I've been seeing between about 35 and 65 meg. Obviously, depending on what's in the shot, depending on what the subject you're shooting, how much information is in the file, they will vary in size, but if you think average, they're going to be around 50. Then you'll be in the right ballpark. In terms of the latitude, I've been shooting RAW files mainly. I have shot JPEGs as well, but I wanted to shoot the RAW files. Currently Lightroom, so the whole Adobe suite doesn't actually allow you to view these files because it's such a new camera. They haven't updated Lightroom or Photoshop. Hopefully that will change in the future soon, but I've been converting them to DNGs and then playing around with them. What I'll do is I'll include some DNGs in the link below so you can have a look at the files yourself. In terms of the dynamic range and the ability to kind of lift shadows, drop highlights, and essentially play around with the files and get some real latitude from them, you're not going to be disappointed. You can do a lot with these files before they start to break up. And again, I've been pretty impressed with the quality of the files coming off of this camera. I think it's up there with one of the best cameras. The A7R4 obviously has higher resolution, but overall, these are some of the best files you'll get in any stills camera on the market, full frame, unless you go up to kind of medium format. Okay, let's move on to autofocus. And I know it's a big one for a lot of you, and coming from something like the EOS R, if you're moving from that to this, I think you're going to be very pleasantly surprised by how good this camera is. The eye autofocus and the animal autofocus is absolutely phenomenal in this. It locks on and sticks to subjects really well. And actually, the mountain biking 3-hour session that I did was a real test of the autofocus in this. And actually, I think if I had had longer with the camera before doing that session and played around with the autofocus modes more, I would have got almost 100% success rate. As it was, it did lose focus a few times, and I think that was mainly just because I was trying different modes on the camera and probably more user error because I haven't used these Canon cameras for a while. I'm not used to the autofocus system, but I would say it's up there in the top 3 cameras I've used alongside the 1DX Mark II and the Sony A9 and A9 II. I would say it's genuinely one of the best for autofocus that you can find currently on the market. If you're shooting anything like portraits, weddings, events, it'll track people's faces and eyes really nicely. If you're doing animals, it will track birds in flight. It is really impressive, and there's so much customization you can do as well in the autofocus menus. You've got kind of all the different, you've got 4 main cases for tracking, and you can change sensitivity and speed and all that good stuff. So yeah, no issues with the autofocus. I think it's one of the best systems out there now. The only thing I'm not a great fan of with the autofocus is if you want animal IAF, you have to select it. So in the menu, you select either animal or person priority or nothing. You can't kind of select. It doesn't seem like you can select just auto, so it will pick between them. You have to sort of tell it. That might come with a firmware upgrade, but I suppose either way, you know what you're going to be shooting generally, don't you? So that's not a big deal. This camera will shoot at 12 frames a second mechanical. You've got an electronic first curtain shutter mode, which will also do 12 frames a second, and then you've got a full electronic mode that will do 20 frames a second. I've tried all 3. I think I really enjoyed shooting 12 frames a second. I actually enjoyed the mechanical shutter probably more so than the fully electronic. I couldn't quite work out why that was. I think there is a slight lag in the viewfinder when you're shooting 20 frames, and there's something about it that just felt a little bit alien. I think partly because I haven't shot with a camera that does that for a while, that's completely silent at that kind of speed. So one thing I would say about the shutter sound on the Canon R5 is the mechanical shutter is quite good in terms of it's quite quiet, and the first curtain's even quieter, and then the full electric is completely silent, and it writes the buffer really quick. The new processor in this camera, I think, is excellent, and it writes to the card really. If you've got fast cards in here, it will write to them pretty quick and you won't be sort of waiting. I should just say that obviously I've only used the camera with these two lenses, but what was good was that this is an RF lens and obviously this is an adapted EF lens, and actually the burst rate I was getting with both these lenses was pretty similar. I actually got about 11 frames a second with the adapted glass. So this is the 24-70 Mark II L lens. And I got, from the timestamps on the shots, I got 12 frames a second with this lens. So I want to try this out with other lenses in the RF mount, which I'm going to try and get hold of and try and hire. But yeah, overall, there's not much difference at all in terms of if you're using adapted glass, particularly, well, I say that, so long as it's on the list of like Canon lenses that it will work really well with. I think they have a list on their website. I'll try and put a link down in the description below. But most of the ones that you would normally be using, if you're coming from the EF mount, will work really well with this camera. And again, the eye autofocus, all the autofocus modes work really well. They've done a really good job with this adapter, and it actually just feels pretty much like a native lens. The only difference being this lens, for example, isn't stabilized, so you get a little bit less stabilization, but we'll move on to that in a minute. Let's talk about the IBIS system in this camera. It's one of the big things that they've implemented in this that they didn't have before, and it's in this and the R6, and they're claiming 8 stops of stabilization. I've done some tests out in the real world, photographing landscapes and things in low light. I've also done a couple of tests which I'll show you now, photographing just a recipe book at slow shutter speeds and seeing how slow I could get hand holding and whether the text would remain clear. And I would say in my testing with the RF glass, with a stabilized RF lens and the stabilization in the camera on, you're gonna be able to shoot down to about a second, maybe more. It kind of depends. There's a lot of factors, but if you're quite steady, and I have to say I'm not the most steady person in terms of holding the camera. I kind of move around a little bit too much, but some people are better than others. But you're going to be able to get some really long shutter speeds with this. It is an excellent IBIS system, and they've actually overtaken Sony, and they're up there with kind of getting towards Panasonic levels of kind of stabilization now for photo and video. And even with the adapted glass, I was impressed with how good the stabilization with this lens was. It's not as good, obviously, and you have a little symbol come up on the screen that shows you that you've got like the little hands with brackets around it which show you IBIS is on. And when I had that lens on, it didn't have the extra plus symbol, whereas on the RF glass you have a little extra plus symbol that shows you've got both the IBIS from the camera and from the lens. So overall, I think it works really well. It really helps if you're in low light situations, or if you're having to hand hold and you haven't got a tripod. You can get some really long shutter speeds with this and still really crisp images. I wanted to talk about rolling shutter, and obviously this applies more to video, but you do notice it when you're in the fully electronic mode on the camera. You do notice if you're doing panning shots like I was with the mountain biking, you do notice that in the fully electronic mode, things that should be straight start to look a little bit wonky. So just be aware of that. Also be aware that with any kind of fully electronic mode like this camera has and the Sonys have, you do get some banding in artificial light sometimes. So it's worth being aware of that, and I think you just understand the limitations of the camera and you can work around them generally. So next thing I wanted to talk about was low light and noise. And again, this camera is very good in low light. I've tested different high ISOs, and I would say up to 12,800, it's probably pretty usable, certainly up to 10,000. Above that, you do start to notice it a lot more. It will go up to 51,000 and expanded, but yeah, I wouldn't push it that far. I think it's doing a very good job, and given the sensor size, I'm pretty impressed with the quality of it. I think compared to like some of the Sony cameras, it's pretty comparable to like the A7R3 and 4. I don't know about the EOS R because I haven't shot low light with that, but I suspect it's probably comparable, probably a bit better. So there's tons of extra features that I'm not going to fully cover in this video, but I can do more videos if you'd like me to. For example, you've got things like exposure bracketing, you've got HDR mode where it will take 3 quick shots and then combine them in camera. You've got focus stacking, so you can stack multiple images, I think up to 999. There's just loads in this camera and loads in the menu system that I haven't yet fully explored, but I will try and do a full long-term review of this in a few weeks' time. Also have the ability to capture 35 megapixel stills out of the 8K video mode, so you can essentially do a grab of a still image from that video if you've got the CF Express card in the camera, which is a nice feature even if you're not into shooting video. Something you can potentially use because that will be shooting at 30 frames a second in video mode, so something to be aware of. The other thing that this camera doesn't have is GPS built in, but you can connect via your phone and get it to work that way, and the Bluetooth app and the connectivity of the camera is excellent. Canon have implemented their kind of wireless transfer system recently, and that works really well. I might do a separate video on all of that stuff because there's quite a lot to go into, but essentially it's one of the best out there now compared to the other manufacturers like Sony and Nikon. There's a good selection of ports on here. You've got HDMI, you've got USB-C, and then you've got a headphone and mic jack as well, and then you've also got a flash sync port on the side there as well. Obviously I've been mainly shooting RAW files with this and a few JPEGs, but I haven't used the HEIF files on this, but again, that's something you've got in camera. You can convert them from HEIF to JPEG, and it gives you a bit more latitude if you don't want to shoot RAW files. Gordon at Camera Labs went into that in a couple of his videos, so check that out if you're interested in that particular aspect. I haven't properly tested that yet. So next thing I want to talk about is overheating, and I've seen a lot of videos online talking about overheating for video, and a lot of them have mentioned that the camera doesn't overheat in stills modes. And until yesterday, I would have completely agreed with that. The 3 hours I did shooting bursts for mountain biking, it was absolutely fine, didn't have an issue. Right at the end of the shoot, the camera kind of locked up and I switched it off and back on and it was fine. I think that may just be a bug in the firmware currently, and I suspect the new firmware that they released for this that's coming soon will address all that sort of stuff. I did have an issue with it yesterday. I just went out, there was a local football match just around the corner, so I just went out and shot a load of bursts. I was basically trying to get the autofocus captured on my Ninja 5, which I will have shown you already, and the tracking, and just to show you the AF points. And so I shot a bit with the external recorder plugged into the HDMI, but still just stills mode, no video. Obviously it was recording what you could see through the viewfinder. And weirdly, it was pretty hot. It was about 32 degrees outside, which is fairly warm for the UK. And I shot for, I don't know, it wasn't that long. It was probably I was only out there for about an hour or so. I only had about 45% battery when I started. And by the end, as you'll see from the clips I'm going to show you, the camera had the overheating warning on. The camera actually ran out of battery before it overheated. And I don't know whether it would have actually overheated, but the timer that you have usually when you're shooting video on the screen that shows basically it goes from 30 minutes down to 0, and when it gets to 0, the camera's going to shut off essentially. That timer was going down and down and down when I was just shooting stills. So I've been shooting outside in the sun and got the overheat warning, only shooting stills. I'm not sure why that is. I need to do some more testing on it. I need to work out whether this will actually properly overheat and shut off in stills mode, or if it just shows 000 on the clock and then just carries on. It was a bit annoying that my battery essentially ran out before I could get to that point yesterday, and I'm gonna have to try it again. But when I had charged the battery a little bit and then put it back in the camera, the overheating warning had disappeared completely. So I think I would still be of the opinion that it probably won't overheat, but I wouldn't say for sure. Like some other people on YouTube have just been basically saying it's not going to overheat in stills mode. I wouldn't be so sure of that. I think in the right conditions, if you're out in the States or somewhere really hot and you're shooting a lot of photographs, say you were shooting an outdoor wedding for a few hours straight and you were shooting bursts, there is the potential to overheat this camera, I think, in stills mode, but we'll have to wait and see. And I'm going to do a lot more testing. I might make a separate video on that if I do find that it can make it overheat. But I wanted to cover that off because I know a lot of people have just been saying flat out there's no overheating issue with stills, and I'm not sure that's absolutely correct. So I wanted to let you guys know. But yeah, in conclusion, I think so far this is probably one of the best cameras I've ever used. It's definitely now the best camera that Canon does, I think, other than the 1DX, which obviously is for sports mainly and fast-paced action. There'll be certain photographers who will want that still, but for everyone else, I think this camera is such a compelling proposition, and certainly up there alongside the A7 R3 and 4. I would love to get an A7 R4 in my hands to do a comparison test, and I will try to do that in the coming weeks and months. But from my initial testing, I just think this is excellent, and definitely highly recommend this camera for anyone looking to move over to the mirrorless system for Canon. And also, if you're looking to upgrade from the EOS R, I think you will find that a lot of the features on this camera are just way better than the EOS R. Again, I've not used the EOS R a huge amount, but I've seen enough from other people's reviews to understand the limitations of that camera. So yeah, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have, please do leave a like. Please do consider subscribing. I'm just about to go over 1,000 subscribers, so very excited about that. And yeah, any questions you've got on the camera, there's loads of things I probably haven't covered yet. So drop questions down below. I try to answer all the questions I get, and I'm going to continue to test this camera over the next few weeks. So yeah, let me know what you want to know, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video.